couple of months ago, my wife and I had dinner with a friend of ours from college that we hadn't seen in a long time. His name is Will, and he was in the area to attend a screening of a film that he had made called Trash Empire. It's a documentary about the 2 years in which Will spent $5.50 on food. The rest came from the trash. See, for 2 years, Will went dumpster diving behind restaurants and grocery stores, living off the food that he found there. What do you think of that? You probably think that it's pretty gross. But as this film points out, all of the food that he found was perfectly fine. Perhaps you're aware that food that's in your fridge or pantry is often still good even after the printed expiration date or the best by date, which is even more arbitrary than the sell-by date. And yet in the United States, where poverty and starvation are still real issues, 40% of still good food is thrown out and wasted. I mean, would you eat an unopened, still sealed box of Oreos that was found in a food dumpster just because it had been past its sell-by date? Well, even with the facts in mind, you might still have feelings of disgust. Richard Beck is a psychology professor at my alma mater, Abilene Christian University. And several years ago, he wrote a book called Unclean, Meditations on Purity, Hospitality, and Mortality. And he opens the book this way. Imagine spitting into a Dixie cup. After doing so, how would you feel if you were asked to drink the contents of the cup? Is that gross? I mean, what's the difference between saliva and spit? Why is one viewed as disgusting? Well, Richard Beck's book is about how feelings of disgust affect Christians and the church and our mission. See, it's one thing to consider food or objects unclean. But what about when we view people as unclean? Would you go to Will's house for a birthday party knowing that all of the food came from a dumpster? Or would you make sure that you had other plans for that day? Well, for the Pharisees, they would have said absolutely not. But throughout the Gospels, they continually criticized Jesus for eating with those considered ritually unclean. I mean, how dare he? What is he thinking? And yet Jesus continually demonstrated that God is more concerned with demonstrating mercy rather than sacrifice. And this is what Jesus tells the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 9, quoting the Old Testament prophets. And Richard Beck notes, sacrifice is about marking off a zone of holiness, admitting the clean and expelling the unclean. Mercy, by contrast, crosses those purity boundaries. Mercy blurs the distinction, bringing clean and unclean into contact. Jesus demonstrated this all the time, much to the disgust of the Pharisees. The ministry of Jesus was the ministry of mercy overcoming disgust. Last week we started a series called The Untouchables and Unclean. And we're looking at stories of the interactions between Jesus and the lepers, the sick, and the unclean people. And these are people who could not be touched and were to be socially avoided. And perhaps we, during this pandemic, can empathize with the Untouchables. And perhaps their stories can offer us valuable lessons for our time. To understand these stories first, we must look at the purity laws of the Old Testament, which framed the context. Now, Leviticus is one of the first places in the Bible where we read about being unclean, and it's the place to go for biblical cleanliness laws. Now, a lot of people associate the unclean with food, and this is a major part of it. A lot of Jews today follow the rules of kosher, eating only food that has been approved and avoiding meats that are unclean, including pork. Now, Leviticus 5 says that if you were to eat or even touch an unclean animal, you had to ritually cleanse yourself, followed by offering up ritual sacrifices of atonement. If you don't have a lamb, then sacrifice 2 pigeons. If you can't afford that, then bring a bag of the finest flour that you have and offer that as a sacrifice. And this is basically to say that everyone, rich or poor, had to pay the price for their uncleanliness. Now, as a reminder, this wasn't just about food, but there were a lot of laws surrounding purity. And most of these involve blood and coming into contact with blood. If you had disease, like leprosy, like we talked about last week, then you were unclean. And according to Leviticus 13:45, you had to wear torn clothes and have unkempt hair, cover the lower part of your face, and when someone comes by, cry out, "Unclean, unclean." Now, looking back, we can understand why a lot of these rules were established. A lot of them involve disease control. And in establishing these laws, God was trying to keep his people healthy. But for those people who were unclean, there was major incentive to do all that you could to atone so that you could re-enter the community of God. Now, with all of this said, there's a moment in the Gospels where Jesus confronts the most unclean person head on. In Luke chapter 8, beginning in verse 26, we read of several miracles that Jesus performs. Now here, Jesus had just performed the miracle of calming the storm on the sea. And he had just displayed power over nature. But in the rest of the chapter, he's about to show just what he's capable of. So they eventually get to the other side of the lake, and when they do, oh man, they are in for a real sight. Because there's a welcome party to greet them. And he's sure not the mayor. Instead, we read that as Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a man from the town who was possessed by demons. Now, this guy was a real mess. We don't know his name, and he's often referred to today as the Gerasene demoniac. But for the sake of the story, let's just call him Crazy Jerry. Crazy Jerry had been kicked out of town for being cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. He was nuts. He was completely naked. He lived in the wild without a house. And not only that, he lived among the tombs of the dead. He was kept chained up, and someone stood guard over him because he tended to thrash around violently. But he had broken those chains and had ran off by himself. Mark tells us that he would cry all night and would cut himself with stones. Now, all of these factors combined does not make this the kind of guy that you would want to invite home for dinner with friends. Now, it should be noted that Jesus was in an area that was largely Gentile. And Crazy Jerry probably wasn't Jewish. But Jesus was. He shouldn't have been anywhere near this man. He lived in a cemetery, and that alone would have made him ceremonially unclean. But ritual purity aside, this man would have looked terrifying and smelled terrible. If you saw him running towards you, you probably would have run in the opposite direction, maybe hopping back into the boat and rowing away as fast as you can. And I'm sure that's what Jesus' disciples were trying to do. But not Jesus. This wild, feral man saw Jesus and he ran up to him, yelling and screaming at the top of his lungs, "What do you want from me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." The demons within this man, they knew exactly who Jesus was. And they knew that they were in trouble because even demons tremble in fear in the presence of God. They knew that God was going to punish them for what they were doing to this poor man. And they cried out to him, begging Jesus to spare them in some way. And Jesus asked the man what his name was, but the demons reply, "Legion, for we are many." What happens next is possibly one of the strangest scenes in the Bible. See, the demons, scanning their options, asked to be cast into a herd of pigs nearby, who Jesus also shouldn't have been around since pigs were unclean. But Jesus gave them demons permission, and they left the man and immediately possessed the pigs, who go crazy, and they rushed over a cliff and into the lake where they drowned. Now, I can't imagine what this would have been like for someone to be off in the distance watching all of this go down. I mean, to see a man and his followers get off a boat, immediately start talking with Crazy Jerry from the village, and then to see Crazy Jerry stop being so crazy, and then to see the herd of pigs freak out and then dive into the lake. Let's just say that this is not something that you see every day. In fact, the people who were tending to the pigs, now realizing that their jobs were suddenly pointless, they ran to town to tell everyone. And immediately people dropped what they were doing and came to check out what was going on. And there, they saw that Crazy Jerry was dressed, fortunately, and he was in his right mind. And he was sitting at the feet of Jesus. The response to the crowd is to be struck with fear, because something out of the ordinary and unexpected just happened. And while they didn't know exactly what it was, they knew that obviously Jesus had something to do with it. In fact, they're so afraid that they asked Jesus to leave. I mean, what else is this guy going to do? Jesus knew that when he wasn't welcome and when it was time to move on, and so he did what they asked. He left. He went back across the lake. He got into the boat and left. And as he does so, formerly Crazy Jerry ran up to him and begged Jesus to let him go with him. Rather than letting him go, though, Jesus told him to go back home. Home. Now that was a place that perhaps Jerry hadn't thought about in a long, long time. Maybe he still had family there. He had a job once. He had friends. He had a life. He hadn't been allowed to go home. But now there was no reason that he couldn't. Jesus told him, go back home and tell everyone what God had done for him. And that is exactly what he did. And in doing so, Jerry became one of the first evangelists to the Gentiles. Now the story continues, and we'll actually pick it right up next week to talk about the two people that Jesus meets next. But let's end by talking about what these people heard. The message that this man had from them was a message of mercy and reconciliation. Jesus had taken he who was cut off from the world and had removed all the barriers that kept him isolated and alone. Jesus didn't just heal him, he restored him. And this is what Jesus continues to do for all of us. But more than this, he calls us into his ministry. 2 Corinthians 5 tells us that God reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. And this message is for everyone, including people we'd rather not minister to, people we would rather avoid, people that we would not normally associate with. These are the people who need the gospel of reconciliation and restoration the most. And by the power of God's Holy Spirit, we do this because we do not see people through the world's eyes of disgust, but through God's eyes of mercy. We have received God's mercy ourselves, and we extend God's mercy to others. Who are the outsiders today? Who are the untouchables and unclean? The good news is for them. Otherwise, it wouldn't be good news. May they hear it. If even those on the far outskirts are welcome into God's kingdom, everyone is welcome. And if you would like to be an insider, if you are in need of God's mercy and reconciliation and God's restoration, let us know. You too can come home. If you are in need of prayers, if you are in need of encouragement, reach out to us. And we would love to show you God's love. Let us know. God be with you all.